We
All
can
right.
start.
Great.
Others will join. Thank you.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. So this is the second meeting where we're trying to look into this OpenMRS flow concept. And maybe just to bring everyone up to speed, there was a document which most of you probably had access to in the past, which is this concept paper, which is really the foundation for a lot of what we're trying to build and iterate upon in these conversations. There's also a set of meeting summary minutes, which are linked to in the chat right now. And this is a good document which provides links to the other documents which we're using. And so to try to add some clarity, we've split kind of into three separate groups, of which it seems for the most part the same people will be in all three groups, but there's user interface, there's workflows and forms, and there's technical architecture. Actually, sorry, I forgot I wasn't sharing my screen here. That might help. I'm just activating it now. My apologies. So are you seeing a screen here with the meeting notes summary document? I don't hear neither a yes nor a no, so it's unclear.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
awesome. Awesome. Perfect. So
some of us do.
awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. So the three sections are user interface design, workflows and forms, and technical architecture. And so each of these groups has its own talk thread as well as its own question document. And so, for instance, for user interface design, there's a talk thread, which is here. And then there's this master document, which kind of holds all the questions. And I was experimenting with kind of having questions for each group, which we can work through on a weekly basis, with the idea that answering these questions, which will get us closer to a final product. And you can go to these reference documents for either user interface design, for workflows, forms, and logic, or for technical architecture. And then inside of there, see the current active questions which we're working on as a community, such as in the technical architecture, we're trying to look at the community health toolkit to see if it's a foundation we can build upon. And we're trying to figure out what would be the technical requirements for this thing we're trying to build. And so these master documents then link out to the specific document where we're working on it. And then if you want kind of an overview, there's also a link to the overall Google Drive hierarchy where each of these documents and then its sub-documents are listed. But I think the easiest way to follow along might just be to follow along in this meeting summary document, where the hope is that each week we'll kind of go through which questions we're working on and then try to figure out what we can take away as far as the next steps. If that sounds good with you guys, maybe today the first question would be on user interface design, just to spend about 10 minutes looking at some of the work Jonathan and I had done, but then spend more of the call talking about workflows and forms, specifically that talk thread which came up earlier in the week regarding the discrepancies between how people are handling programs, visits, and forms, and then spend the last half hour today talking more about the technical architecture, specifically anyone who had looked into OpenMRS Flow and what their findings had been, and if we can move on from that, or if we should continue to look into that and what additional questions we have. And then what would be specifically some of the goals which we actually want to have in an OpenMRS architecture for this new front-end application. And so if you were to open up question one, what are the core component library elements for Deluxe Medical record system, you'll find a reasonably long document which is kind of a high-level skeleton outline of a component list. The goal for this call isn't really to go through too much detail. If you want, you can look through it and see this clinical component library that Jonathan, Tobin, and I have been working on. And the thought is that we're trying to essentially think, if you were building a workflow or a form, what would be the categories of panels you might want to pull into that type of environment, and then have each of these panels as pre-built elements which you can just pull in. And each pre-built element is connected to the user interface, is connected to the concept dictionary, and it's connected to the database. And so the plan for this week, or at least for I think Jonathan and I, is to continue going through this document and expanding it until we have a more complete list. Jonathan, did you want to maybe talk about the document you're working on there?
Yes. Hang on. There we go. I think I'm off mute sufficiently now. Yeah, I think that's fair. And what we're trying to do is do several different things. As you see, there's kind of a thread on UI tools and kind of what are the various little software components that go together. I have another document which I'm putting together, and I'll show that when I get a chance, on kind of the different kinds of clinical functional components, as we've talked about, which is really to say, okay, if you start out from an ambulatory workflow, what do you want to do? You want to document, you want to order, you want to view. What do you want to view? You want to view results, you want to view observations, and so on. And kind of there's a goal to be able to get all those together, to understand what the kind of the large set of that is, and then also to map those to some of these UI concepts. The overall idea being that we should be able to take any workflow, assign it to 5 or 6 or 7 of these particular workflow functional components, and then be able to have access to standard well-built UI components to handle them. And then also the design that we eventually do for the UI components can be done with being informed of these different kinds of workflows. So really trying to put a bridge between some of these workflow pieces and the UI pieces. But I think this is something else we can talk about as we go along.
Great, thank you. I think, we still have a lot of work to do on these two areas. Feel free, but the documents, you should be able to go in and add any commentary you want if you pull it up. And of course, if you send me your email, I can add your email to the master folder hierarchy, which would be located here. And then you'll be able to add directly into any of the documents and edit them, of course, in real time. I don't know if there's any questions around user interface at this time, or if we want to move more into workflows and forms. I think, as I said, the major action from the user interface was just to keep on carrying on and trying to build out a more detailed set of components which we could use as an example.
So, hey, sorry for joining late. This is Burke. I think one thing that we want to be, especially early on, very aware of or make sure we can adapt to is that it's not just fitting within a framework that we've designed, but how can we say, for example, a site wants to introduce registration or immunization functionality or a whole new set of functionality, and ensuring that we have the space or the approach that, from a UI perspective, that will allow them in a very lightweight way to say, oh, you've already got that functionality coded out. Here's a way it could kind of plug in and play nicely with this. And, so in terms of long-term vision, where we can get to plug and play and people can just drag and drop their whole workflow, that's great. But I think early on, we need to be able to play nicely alongside maybe existing functionality, or if someone says, hey, I can get some of my work done using what we're creating here together, but there's this other big chunk of work or application I need to run in concert with it, and I need users to be able to get to that easily.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Absolutely, Burke. And I think that if you look at some of the diagrams and some of the things that Greg's done, that I've done a little of, but mainly Greg in this case, will show that where we're trying to combine the new with the old. And we've had that in previous discussions where we want to not only build a wonderful new world, but also make it possible for you to continue to do your work while that's happening. So that's going to be an interesting question of its own as to how to make sure that these interfaces stay consistent as we go along.
And from the workflow perspective, I think Jonathan, you may have been the one to point this out, is that there's there's a difference in if you're looking at a patient workflow versus a user's workflow, and I don't know if there's some terminology or a way we can approach that doesn't conflate those two in terms of and we also have, I think, a couple layers. There's the form, like I need to get this form completed, which is the typical pattern that people approach. But we have something that's a little bigger than a form, which is the kind of the order session or the user session. And I don't, I maybe reading the documents, I haven't gotten a chance to. Maybe I'll find all those things named. But I think just being clear that we don't, because workflow can be a little overloaded. Some people might be picturing, a workflow of user going in a session. Some people might be picturing a workflow of a healthcare worker having a list of patients they need to work through, and other people might be thinking of the patient going through a clinic or a hospital. So I don't know how you're thinking of kind of clarifying or naming those things.
Yeah, and I think in the document that I just put in the chat, which I'm going to actually merge with one of the flow documents very shortly. I was just doing this late last night. But there's kind of three different aspects of that. One is that there are these functional components. There are these things you want to do to view and to order and so on. So those have what you talked about in terms of filling out a form or doing a table or something else like that, doing a report. Those are kind of the verbs, and they act on the concept, of course, like concepts that we've been doing in CL and elsewhere. So the concepts are an order, a patient, a admission, and so on. And some of those are done that way. And then they just kind of roll up into different workflows, which kind of start from a login, and then that login, as we do now, is going to branch into, well, if I'm logging in, but I have access to administrative functions that I want to do those, send me there. If I log in, but I'm a patient and I have access to certain patient functions, what do I do there? So one aspect is, a reasonable tree of authorization to do different things and different functions you can get in a menu. The second is kind of trying to organize and homogenize these different kinds of functions so that there's a small number of tools that can do them. But to your point about connecting to existing things, I think we're trying to connect and modify the same kinds of concepts and clinical data that we have now. So that's something that has to be done smoothly.
Perfect. Maybe we can move on to the second part, which actually is talking about workflows. So I think this ends up to be very good timing here. And so if you link in through that meetings note, you'll find under workflows and forms, the question which we were dealing with this last week was, how do implementers currently implement programs, workflows, departments, programs, visits, forms, and encounters in their current state? And if you click through that link, you'll find yourself in this document here, kind of the implementer survey. And we actually ended up getting an indirect implementer survey because there was a talk discussion on April 5th regarding how people were actually using programs, visit types, and encounters. And there seemed to be a number of workarounds and wide variation in how people were controlling which forms they were showing. I think the thing which would be helpful to get out of today's call would be, one, if any organizations were interested in maybe adding to this document and just kind of briefly outlining how they think about workflows, programs, all these different elements. And then maybe we could have a conversation for about 15 minutes today, building off of that talk thread earlier in the week about the variation in ways people are managing the data structure. So I'll open it up from here. I noticed Partners in Health had commented on the talk post that they were using a workaround as well for displaying programs, visit types, encounters. I don't know if they wanted to explain what they were doing, and then maybe JJ could jump in about how AMPATH is doing, and some of the other groups could as well.
I didn't really, this is Mark from Partners in Health. I didn't really, did we really use a I don't think, did we imply we used a workaround?
Not really a workaround. I mean, I think we, in Malawi, for example, we have a custom patient dashboard that, with various validation rules that guides the user to only allow users to do certain things under certain, circumstances. So, it does not allow sort of the generic creation of data based on metadata, but would say, if you have these attributes on the patient record, then you can create you can enroll in a program of this nature. Only if you are not enrolled in that program can you assign these types of identifiers. And then only if you're in this state can you transition to this other state. Only if you're in this program with these identifiers in this state can you, record a certain type of encounter. But I mean, those business rules are sort of embedded into, just like on the front end almost in that particular app within that distribution. But there's nothing implied about. I was just saying we found the need to introduce those sorts of custom validations in order to ensure a high degree of data quality and make sure that the right types of encounters, the program for identifiers are assigned to the right types of qualified. So that's a generally useful paradigm that I think a lot of implementations are looking to do. There's nothing built into the data model right now that enables that.
So for us, this is JJ from AMPATH. I think what drove the process for trying to think about what we call workflows is the issues that we had with the expanding number of users and the different types of clinical programs that those users would be accessing. And so for a while, we had a place where you could start a visit and it would just list every form that we had available, independent of disease program. And so that list grew and grew and grew and grew. It was to the point where it was quite bulky and very, very poor user experience, and frustrated people just saying we want it easier to find the form that we're supposed to fill out. So that kind of initiated the process. And then, as we started, we looked into, what could we kind of use on the UI front from within the OpenMRS data model to help drive the process. And essentially, we settled on programs, and we created a back-end mapping table, which is not part of the AMRS schema or OpenMRS schema, which basically says which encounter type or which visit types belong to which program, and then which forms belong to which visit type. And along the way, we kind of made it, there was increasing needs to have a little bit of control over the logic over what got displayed. And so, for example, for HIV, if you start a return visit, there's logic that will only show forms based on the age of the patient. And those are kind of represented in a JSON schema as I think just JavaScript functions. In the end, we have this kind of Frankenstein approach to being able to solve this kind of core challenge, which is, how do we guide the user through what they're supposed to know about this patient? And we don't want it just to be about the UI. We don't want it just to be about which form is supposed to be filled out, but we wanted it also to help kind of allow the designer of the system to maybe generate alerts based on what program the patient was in, and some decision support, and perhaps even make down the road or order sets available that were specific to various clinical programs. Some sort of comprehensive approach to kind of what it means for a patient to be in a clinical program and what a user would like to be able to do within the system from that. But we're definitely looking for a better kind of solution to this.
This is Mark from PIH. This makes me think more. Sorry, I lost connection for a second when Mike was talking. So if Mike already explained this, feel free to stop me. But in the PIGMR, we kind of have two ways we kind of show what forms are available. Mainly, we use the app framework extension. So there's an extension that you can have. You control which expensive displays based on both privileges and sort of a generic required function, which has access to the underlying like patient. So you can say if the patient's less than 15, this extension is available. And that extension might be like, you know, enter the HIV intake form or something like that. And then also you come up with the idea of there's the clinical summary dashboard in Core Apps. We've made a way where that can be customized for program. It's just basically a way you can have, really all this is a way you can have multiple dashboards and each of those can have different extensions. There might be some forms that are only, I don't think we actually do this yet, but there can only be some forms that are only available on, say, the HIV dashboard, which you would only see if you were enrolled in a program. So it's kind of based upon, you know, like the app framework extensions and what dashboard is visible. It's not really directly tied into the data module as much, which, you know, is a little bit of a limitation, I guess.
If I could just add one thing, and then I'll pass the mic. But you know, the other hope that we had was to make a process relatively simple for us to onboard new clinical programs, so that we wouldn't be spending so much time developing custom UIs for each clinical program as they came on.
I guess maybe just to clarify a difference in approach. From what I'm hearing, JJ, it sounds like we are hoping that a schema would control what the user interface showed based on the forms and the order sets, for instance. And then what PIH is discussing is almost using the opposite approach of using the application framework. Or is that a user interface component to almost then describe what data to show? Is it approaching the same issue? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a good schema, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. That's probably a better way to do it. So I wouldn't call them opposites. I don't really know totally how to describe ours. Ours is somewhat tied into the UI, I guess. It would be good to have it extrapolated from that.
Yeah, I guess maybe not opposites, but I think I was suggesting that Ampath was trying to to generate a UI based on something from the data, and then it sounds like PIH was more using the UI to try to control what data to show. Looking for an area of commonality, I think both of us, it looks like was having trouble with the concept of visits. From Paul's discussion on the talk thread, he suggested that the initial purpose was for a patient to be in one visit for the entire outpatient encounter. But or at least from what I could tell, it looked like several organizations might be enrolling a patient in multiple visits within the same appointment, let's say. I don't know if other people had noticed that or had workarounds or suggestions.
Yeah, and I think that's a specific area. Certainly, yeah, we were sort of talking about whether this was medically true, philosophically true, and whether the data model actually supports it, because sounds like traditionally it did not. So that's one piece. I just want to sort of latch on to some of the different examples that JJ and Mark and Mike and others are doing to talk about how you start with I've logged in now I've gotten to patients, I've gotten to a particular patient, and now based on my authorizations and what the patient's in, I want to, see particular things, or I want to have certain functions available to me. And it sounds like for everybody, there's that kind of a hierarchy. And the question is really how it's driven. I just want to share one thing for just a second. I can sharing starts to work. And so this is the hierarchy that we're working on, and this is something which is going to have to expand before it contracts. But if you can see this, this is kind of taking you down kind of levels of operations. So starting with login, the second is kind of what you see after you log in, and that could be such things as viewing an inbox of mine, viewing an entire unit, viewing a list of patients, which is a pretty common one, certainly at a point of care point or for a program. In fact, that's there also for patient care managers to be able to see patients on a program. So any of those are going to get you a kind of top level menu that gets you down into where the patients are. And then once you're in patient functions, then you have various ways to go into different things that I can view, different things that I can document. I think somewhere down here, there's kind of a pathway view. So what I'm trying to see is that it sounds like all these fit some sort of a hierarchy of going from I'm started to, okay, now I've got a patient, to now I'm seeing a particular view and I want to do various kinds of modifications on it, or orders or decision support. So I'm very interested in what not only you two groups, what Bomni's done, what other folks have done that kind of either supports that model or requires it to go somewhere else. But it feels like that's a hierarchy that we could probably reproduce, and that's something that ideally one could change from situation to situation by configuring various kinds of schemata. Let me get back to share.
Yeah, so from a design standpoint, from the architecture, I think we're going to have, and we already have examples where people are trying to organize and really filter content that's appropriate. And it goes all the way to saying, well, we want to actually drive people through a workflow. And in general, whether you're talking about a user session or you're talking about a patient going through a workflow through, or the more program-based of like, someone logging in and once they select a patient, what things show up for them. I think the general approach I would prefer we take is one where we generally approach it as a kind of random access. Here are the different types. Here are the things that belong, that are in this bag that are appropriate for this program or for this patient. So collecting that metadata so the system knows and can help, drive UIs by providing the knowledge of here's the things appropriate within this context. And then we can always layer on top of that some kind of, basic rules like dependency, like you can't do step 9 unless step 6 has been done. Those kinds of things as kind of a lightweight way to help enforce validity or help drive, what users see or how they go through. But I want us to be careful not to be overly prescriptive of workflows. I think if you try to design or program out a specific workflow, you end up frustrating as many or more users than you help, and especially in a system where we're trying to serve so many different implementation needs. I think we need to err on the side of being, kind of random access. I think a big step toward that can be just being able to know, and for the system to know, these are the things that are appropriate, so that an application can say, oh, well, I know I can limit it down to these forms, or I can limit it down to these order types or whatever. Another point I just want to get across is that I think we should be looking very, very heavily at FHIR and FHIR's model to see where these kinds of things are being thought of or are worked out, and to the extent they exist, we should be adopting that because the world is turning to FHIR and more, and we as a community need to be headed that direction. In fact, I would say at some point our whole platform should be a FHIR API. But short of that, I think creating our own kind of completely 90-degree orthogonal approach that takes something that FHIR is doing and does it in a completely different way will end up biting us down the road.
No, I certainly agree about FHIR. And just to clarify, I think that with regard to the workflows, I certainly agree with you. We don't want to be prescriptive. What I'd like to see is the ability to have this kind of framework and be able to, plug in different things, plug in different elements, different functions, different such as things are necessary. And I think that's the joy, hopefully, is that all of these different elements and functions can play together nicely. So if you have a top level and a middle level and a next level, then ideally you can configure whatever goes into those.
Perfect. Thank you. We have just 25 minutes left, so if it's okay with people, I'd like to move on to the third part, the technical architecture. I think as action items for next week, there are two. The first is, and you can add your names if you want into that notes document, but if people from any of the partner or implementer organizations wanted to just briefly describe how they think about these different elements of visits, encounters, and programs, that would be very helpful, because Tobin was planning to go through this and wanted to see how different implementations are currently using OpenMRS data structures, what things they've added to the OpenMRS data structure to meet their requirements. And then he wants to, as Burke had mentioned, look to see how FHIR is currently managing workflows and care pathways, and see if we can begin to create a way forward which could marry what implementations are doing, what OpenMRS is doing, and looking to the future with FHIR.
Greg, where was that again? Where do you want to add that?
Oh, just in the under names, under action. If you go to the minutes for today, under workflows and forms, the action item that way we'll just know to wait to follow up for input on those documents, and then Tobin will go through them and try to collect it into a synthesis.
Oh, got it. Mike probably beat me to it, or somebody added us already.
And sorry, go ahead.
Can I? This is JJ. So forgive my obtuseness on these matters, but it's not clear to me, this process and this discussion that we're having right now. It's not clear to me how it informs actual work in terms of developing these ideas. And I suspect that all of you guys who've been doing this longer than me as an infrequent visitor to these calls do know how this progresses, but is this supposed to be a technical working group that is empowered to then provide recommendations? Not empowered, but will provide recommendations to somebody who's going to take this on, or what's the process here? Because I feel like these are good ideas, but for me, I want to finish the end of this conversation and know what's going to happen before next week, instead of just hoping something will happen.
Yeah. So in general, I think that we use the design forums as a way within the community just to coordinate and where we can collaborate on design and how we're approaching something. So at the bare minimum, we're saying, let's try to make sure that the folks that are working on this, and both whether they're designing kind of where we're headed and trying to lay out a roadmap, or they're planning on doing their next feature over the next week or the next month, that we can start to get a shared vocabulary and a shared approach and less chaos. So if any, at a fundamental level, it's trying to cut back on the entropy and trying to increase the likelihood of aligned approaches. But in a more pragmatic standpoint, I would say what I hear Greg doing is trying to step us through some actual action items of saying, let's get some of this documented so we have it shared, people can throw rocks at it. And so that as people start to work on, say, the web framework, or start to build up something, just even prototyping something, there's more than just whatever you can whip up. There's some guidance in terms of where the community is, that, if we can get some basic description of oh, here we'd like to use these FHIR resources for this kind of, planning, or we want to head toward that. But right now what we have is programs. And so here's how we can model it with programs in a way that would allow us to get to FHIR. I mean, I think that's what I hear we're driving toward.
Yeah, I do think there's now close enough to the point, and Greg is kind of directing this. Will get us through this, but I think we're at the point where these different work streams are now kind of defined, or at least they are identified, and ideally there'd be chances for each one of those to get some dedicated work. For example, in workflows, I know that there's a challenge to get together with people that have done this and try and establish whether we can make a framework that will work for all of us and that can work going forward. So one is to try and elaborate the framework. The second is that fairly soon we want to see how this starts to work against an example. As we talked about in Nairobi, starting to see how, if we did an NCD flow sheet or something else like that, we would start to learn things about how to elaborate out this model. So I think each of the streams is going to have work to do.
Yeah, I think.
And just to add, I think, when we talked on Thursday, we did talk a little bit about having a clear vision for where this is going. And I think these conversations, this group is helping move us in that direction and get a tighter vision. Because I think having that is going to be really helpful for others in the community to understand what's going on and where they can contribute.
Yeah, I think
I think to be fair to JJ's point is also, it's not enough for folks on the call to agree, oh, here's an approach. We need to be pushing toward artifacts, which I think thanks to Jonathan, Tobin, and Greg, I have high hopes we will, but to push toward artifacts that actually are real, written down, informative in terms of helping guide design instead of just being on a call and talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, the purpose of these calls are that we can eventually build stuff. But before we can build stuff, we need to know what it is we're going to build. And before we know what it is we're going to build, we need to have a certain sense of alignment on what the smallest version of that could be. And so the hope is that by putting out that concept paper last week, we can at least say, well, here's a potential thing we can build. And then the hope is through these they're very, low ball action items. They have, like, in my opinion, like very low levels of buy-in required. It's the first time we're trying it. And that's kind of the purpose of why they're so low target at this time, is just to practice essentially using action items. And the hope is that we can, the thing that Jonathan, Tobin, and I don't have a clear understanding is exactly the variation between the different implementers which are wanting to work together. And so that's why a lot of these questions are understanding the variation that exists so that we can marry the variation into FHIR. Any other questions maybe on kind of the purpose for these calls, and then we could go into looking at the technical architecture?
I guess I appreciate the helping me through this understanding this process. I think the only thing that I'm a little worried about is, like, this process I think works well for adding new components or widgets into the existing framework, but it's not clear to me that this is a mirror of that. This feels like more foundational, and as a result, it's not obvious. Like, we can talk about making prototypes, but like for us, and I would be curious to hear what other implementers think, it's not really obvious how you'd take one of these prototypes and do anything with it. And so it seems like it needs a more, I'm sorry for like hijacking this call, and this probably just should have another call, and at least it can just be food for thought. But I feel like we need a grander plan than just like, we're gonna come up with an MVP and build a prototype and then hope that like does something. And I'm not trying to like, I know you're all very intelligent people and have greater plans than that, but it'd be nice to be a little bit more explicit in terms of kind of what we're going to achieve and how we're going to achieve it.
Yeah, I mean, well understood and appreciated. I think there have been people that have been talking about moving forward and those directions. I mean, I for one would say two things. We started out saying, hey, we want to make it possible to have innovators build things that can be used by other people, to make, number one. Number two, to make it easier for innovators to actually fit things into the framework very quickly. And also, number three, to make it possible for people who are not innovators to be able to have access to all these wonderful things that the innovators have done, to be able to put together an operation for themselves based on pulling things out of a library and so on. I think that the two prongs that this group is talking about. One is to, sort of elaborate out what this picture looks like, which still has a little bit more to go. And second, to in fact do a prototype that helps test some of it out, and helps understand where those things need to have be course corrected. I mean, I think those are pretty good directions. They're not done yet, neither one, obviously, and this group will continue to do them. But I think that I do agree we should probably set up some group work streams as soon as we can, and I think we're getting very close to that point. But I think that those two pieces seem like a reasonable way to get going.
Yeah. So
Mark.
can we like table the meta discussion? We could have it on talk or something. And I think I don't want to spend the rest of the 20 minutes or whatever talking about why we're talking about what we think we're talking about. But I can tell you from a very pragmatic, just a real quick elevator pitch. We are working, as you know, with to get Joel from the single page app single SPA to try to get a hackathon together to hack out a prototype. And then if we like what the direction that's going, or we see a promise in that, we'll probably even hire him to crank out, get us beyond a prototype to like a initial, bootstrap us into something we can start building against. And so from a very pragmatic standpoint, I see a very clear path where we can get from ideas to a practical, like helping folks like Partners in Health and AMPATH start developing on a shared web application framework. But one of the key things that we're going to need is not just what do those implementations need and what are their priorities or requirements, but we're also going to need to know some of this modeling stuff of like, how are we going to represent, how are we going to know, as everybody said, we want to be able to not just have every form show up, we want to be able to constrain to appropriate forms. How are we going to store that information and or share that information? And I think in the near term, it's probably going to be some hacky using programs. And then the longer term, we're going to be like, well, we should be moving toward these FHIR resources, or we should be, adding this feature to the platform so that we can do that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So let's move now. We have about 13 minutes here into the last part on the technical architecture. And there's two documents, and because of time, the first document, I'll just bring it to your attention, and perhaps people could look at it this week. But it's a document where it asks the question of what technical features should be in OpenMRS flow. And so if you look through this document this week, you can try to identify what features are absolute musts as far as what level of offline functionality is required, what level of responsive design or security or cloud deployment is required. Where is there a high level of uncertainty on these technical requirements, things as specific JavaScript frameworks or UX components or FHIR standards? And what would you consider technical requirements we shouldn't even be discussing because it's too far off for this near-term discussion? And so I'd encourage anyone, if they're looking at the minutes, to add their names to the action items here, if they're looking to look over this document this week and perhaps add a few ideas to it. And again, those minutes are linked in the talk thread, and this is under Technical Architecture Question 1. You can add your names in, which then brings us perhaps to the last 12 minutes on Question 2, which revolves around the Community Health Toolkit. And I would be interested to hear from anyone who's had a chance to look through it this week and what your thoughts are as far as its strengths, its limitations, if there's specific areas which you require further clarification for, and perhaps if people could add as action items specific questions they have about the Community Health Toolkit as a platform we could collaborate building with, because then we could set up a call with Medic Mobile and their system architects to try to talk through some of the concerns that we might have about using it or potential opportunities. So I'll just open it up from here.
Did folks get a chance to look at the Community Health Toolkit and see some of what they're doing? My impression from what I saw was that they're trying to create a fairly kind of library of widgets, kind of a shared approach to building community health tools, and it looks like it's focused kind of toward mobile and offline support, and probably not as heavy on what's behind it in terms of what the server receiving those data are in terms of how it would be analyzed. They use Postgres, but the question would be, well, could OpenMRS be the? So when I look at it, I see a great general approach to a problem in terms of finding a collaborative way to build and having enough defined that people can contribute to that, and obviously people are using it, and so that's a great model for us to replicate. I think the question is to what extent can we jump in and use or join community health tools. It's hard. What I don't see as clearly is community health tools the approach or the what they've built of library functions. Is that something that's going to be like how you build an EMR? It seems to me more to be focused on the problem at hand, which is getting workflow of community health workers and providing the tools for them. And so I guess the question I don't have answered or I didn't see clear was, is this something that we could just join and add widgets to, and something that would provide us the framework that's meeting all our needs for an EMR application? Or is this something where we're following and learning from their approach? We could mimic the same approach for what we're trying to build and collaborate on, and then maybe not try to rebuild a community health piece to it, but integrate with community health toolkit. That's where I am.
I'm in line with you, Burke. I think that I think it's the latter for the most part. That they're a good example, but I think that they can contribute quite a lot. I liked what they were doing. I liked the it was a pretty pragmatic approach. It addressed a problem. I also thought that they did one thing that we are talking about, which is they kind of had a standard mapping, if you will, of certain kinds of functions to certain kinds of user tools, as you say, mobile oriented and particularly towards community and so on. But I think that part was useful. I think that they probably did them kind of on a one-to-one basis. This function goes to this function goes to that, whereas we are trying to make things that are a little bit more reusable and repeatable. But I think that there was some very nice stuff there. I think it was clean, and I think that they probably learned some lessons that we need. I actually kind of hope that if we we can learn something from what they've done, as well as some of what each of the groups here has done, what AMPATH has done, what Bomni has done, and be able to talk together in some way as we're continuing to flesh out this model and say, let's learn some good things about each part from each of this. So if we guide a discussion about how to assemble and build what we're talking about, then they would certainly be one of the contributors.
Yeah, I just don't know, is a community health toolkit something that you, for example, could build the point of care solution that AMPATH needs, or Partners Health needs, or that GEMB needs, or is it really aiming to solve the kind of the workflow of a community health worker going out in the field kind of thing, which is definitely something they need, but it may be, okay, well, let's leverage community health toolkit to implement that and then mimic the best parts of their approach in creating another toolkit or a flow or whatever it is, and for OpenMRS to kind of solve the EMR specific.
Yeah, I had a chance to look at their mock-ups for their the anticipated UX redesign that they're currently undergoing. And I think that it would be very easy to, from a strictly user interface perspective, to build the additional EHR user interface components which we required and to put them into their general framework user interface structure. I think the bigger question is, deeper down from the user interface, how much is it able to take their back-end data structures and those types of models and adapt them to an EMR, and how much are they working to tweak those types of questions? But I think that in some ways it provides a tremendous advantage of, here's a tool which they've been working on for a long time. They're a very well-resourced organization, very well-skilled with a lot of technical expertise. And if we're thinking about this model of trying to bring as many organizations together for shared libraries and tool sets, trying to align ourselves with the largest community health worker tool, drives that mission. And I do worry sometimes if we might be missing an opportunity to try to align the global health informatics community here if we just decide to go build our own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm ready to go with them lock, stock, and barrel, but I do think I want to learn more about what they've done. Obviously, as you say, Greg, they've got lots of experience, and I do feel like what they've done is expandable. Although, to Brooke's point, it may turn out that it's not as deep as what we're trying to do. But I would love to kind of get them to host a session for an hour or so and just ask a bunch of questions, and maybe this is something which a workflow group could home in on. To your point, they seem to have a lot of good user tools.
There's been a little bit of ongoing discussion in the talk thread of the OpenMRS flow technical architecture about the possibility of integration. And I'll just sort of reiterate what I was saying there. Like, I think, while the architecture of a community health toolkit is really, really cool with Pouch and Couch providing pre-synchronization. It's completely distinct from what we're doing. And I think it'd be like, whereas CHT could possibly be expanded to someday be an EMR, I think it'd be very challenging to figure out how to meaningfully integrate things from CHT into OpenMRS.
One question I had for them would be, would it be possible if we could build all of these components using Fire and on the user interface level, and then somehow have the client-side application pass these Fire resources to the user interface, but then more to what Brandon was talking about in that his talk thread built some sort of a layer which takes data out of the OpenMRS database and then moves it to the client side, transforming it into Fire, so that in the long run, as we potentially add more Fire resources into the OpenMRS data structure, that transformation wouldn't have to happen. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just understanding what problem are they trying to solve, what's their scope, and are they modeled as an application that expects someone has a work queue and a set of patients to see and a bunch of questions to answer, or are they just a generic kind of workflow engine and they can handle anything? Do they have the notion, or how would you fit in the notion of encounters and visits and orders, knobs, and those kinds of things? And is that, does that take them out of scope, the point that we actually do them a disservice by trying to conflate the two? They're technical questions of the general goals, design, mission of CHT that I don't know the answers to.
Mm-hmm. And I suspect that we'll probably always have.
With them?
Yeah, I can coordinate that if you like. Who should I make sure is? I'll send out. Who would like to be included on that call, just so that I'll include you on a doodle.
I would love to be part of that. I would love to be part of that conversation. To me, from the CHT side, the person I'd like to be talking to is probably Isaac or folks that are as technically knowledgeable and kind of involved in the technical roadmap for CHT. Those would be the people that I think would be most likely to know the answers to the questions I'd have.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. We've got 2 minutes left. And so just to review today here, I think we had a question about what the purpose of these weekly design calls are. And my purpose is so that we can build stuff. And I think the initial phase of these calls is going to be a certain amount of understanding the scope and exactly what we are building so that we can develop the documents that we could eventually hand to developers, whether those are developers on our own teams or whether potentially third-party developers we can introduce into the project. There's a minutes meeting folder which has all the information we require. On user interface design next week, we'll come back with more details on this component library that we've been working on. On the workflows side,
Thanks, guys. I got to run. Take care.
thank you. Hopefully some groups will be able to add in their current state for programs and departments so that Tobin can figure out how that integrates with FHIR. And then on technical architecture, we're going to schedule a call with Medic Mobile where we can ask them questions. And I ask that people take a look at the technical features document so that we actually have an idea of what the scope that we're looking for in this technical framework. That's all the questions I had for today, but I'll open it up if there's anything else.
I just want to put a question out there with no answer because I also have to leave. But I'd be curious to hear at a future point if we went all in on FHIR, how that would change the process that we're going through now in terms of building OpenMRS 3.0. So I'll leave it at that and see you next week.
Thank you. And if you have any suggestions on how we can improve the format for these calls, please let me know as well.